Good morning, everyone. Hello, and thank you for joining for this morning's session. My name is James Pigott. I'm the marketing manager here at Tussell, and I'll be acting as chair for today's session. Today, we're diving into the key findings from Tussell's latest Strategic Suppliers Report, our annual flagship analysis into the UK government's 39 most important suppliers. Everyone on this call has hopefully had a chance by now to read the report, so you'll all hopefully know our findings paint a somewhat mixed picture for this critical cohort. Their collective share of the public sector market has hit a 5-year low, while UK-based strategic suppliers are losing out to international peers. By unpacking their performance, we learn about the state of play in the UK public sector market today, where priorities lie, buyers' shifting sentiments, and glimpses of opportunity and caution for suppliers and buyers of all shapes and sizes. How the strategic suppliers are doing is very much the litmus test we at Tussell use to monitor the state of public procurement today. To help us do this, I'm delighted to be joined today by Gus Tugendhat, founder and MD here at Tussell, and also Hollie Hodgson, head of account management, also here at Tussell. The format of today's session is very simple. We've handpicked a number of the most significant findings from this year's report, which you can see on screen now, alongside a QR code to access a PDF of the report, so you can follow along with us. I'll introduce each of these key findings in turn, and then hand over to Gus and Hollie for their insights and reflections on what these trends mean for both suppliers and buyers. Gus will take us through more of the policy and political context behind the numbers, while Hollie will draw on her years of experience working with many of the strategic suppliers, but also major contracting authorities to help the suppliers on this call see the market through the eyes of the buyer. At the end, we'll also leave time for audience Q&A, so I would strongly encourage everyone on the call to leave your questions and comments either in the public chat or click the Q&A button in the bottom panel to leave an anonymous question. Otherwise, I would treat this session a bit like a live interactive podcast. You can listen along the background and still follow the discussion plenty well, but we will have a few slides on screen to bring the data to life, but you won't miss anything crucial if you're multitasking or this tab is somewhere else. So without further ado, let's jump into our first key finding. So our first key finding is that there have been no changes in the strategic suppliers lineup. So as of the report's publication in October, there were 39 designated strategic suppliers that you can see on screen now. For the first time since we started reporting annually on the strategic suppliers back in 2019, there have been no changes in the group's composition between any two reports. So I think, Gus, let's go to you first. I think this is a good way to open the discussion before we get to the kind of meat of the report with some definitions. So first up, Gus, what exactly is a strategic supplier to government?
Good morning, James, and good morning to everyone on the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's just kind of go back a little bit. The UK government's strategic supplier programme was launched by the coalition government back in 2010-2011 during the austerity period in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And it was set up as a means of imposing more financial and risk controls over suppliers to government that were deemed not just big, but critical. And there is a distinction between those two things. The crux of the initiative was involved assigning Crown representatives to act as a single point of contact for the government when dealing with major suppliers on topics like value for money, risk management, innovation, etc. The programme was significantly upgraded in 2018 in the wake of the collapse of Carillion, a large outsourcer and supplier to government, which was a reminder, I think, to everyone of the importance of having a healthy and resilient supply chain. Finally, being a strategic supplier is seen by a lot of people as a sort of kind of privilege or badge of honor, if you like. But actually, in my opinion, it's more of a responsibility for the supplier that comes with significant overheads to meet the highest standards and additional reporting requirements associated with being a critical supplier. At the same time, as our data shows, it's not actually any guarantee of preferential treatment by the government.
Excellent.
There
Yeah,
we
thank you,
go.
Gus. Good opening definitions. So bearing that in mind, why might it be that their lineup didn't change between this report and last year's report?
Well, in a nutshell, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The market structure hasn't changed. There hasn't been kind of there hasn't been sufficient disruption to kind of change the lineup. And I think sometimes the government should be given more credit for just leaving things alone when they're actually working. And I think this is an example of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Gus. So sticking on this theme of the strategic suppliers concept, the program, Hollie, over to you. Recently, the NHS introduced its own strategic suppliers program, which many on the call may or may not be aware of. To you, what does this imply about the program's success?
Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for joining. So, as James said, for those that aren't aware, so the NHS Strategic Supply Programme, it was announced in May this year. It includes 15 strategic suppliers for health. It's managed by Department for Health and Social Care, NHS England for now, and the Cabinet Office. So, likewise to the central government programme, it includes 4 Crown reps, all with formidable experience in the healthcare sector. And the focus of the reps, likewise, is really around driving collaboration, unlocking value, managing risk, all of the typical supplier relationship management approaches. Yes, you'd assume that means that the central government programme is working, but does that mean that the NHS equivalent will be successful? That's actually a really hard area for Tussell to comment on. The reason being, and I won't get too in the weeds with procurement regulations, but many of the firms in the NHS programme provide clinical or sort of pharmaceutical services, and these aren't in scope in terms of the Procurement Act. So this means that despite the government seeing these suppliers as so critical to the NHS that they require the same hands-on approach, their wealth of spend actually isn't being publicly declared to the same level.
Excellent. Thank you, Hollie. Just conscious of time, we have lots of findings to get through in this presentation, so I will be moving swiftly on to the first key major finding from this year's report, which is that the strategic suppliers' share of the public sector market hit a 5-year low in the latest fiscal period. So in FY 24-25, the strategic suppliers' collective share of the public sector market drifted down to 10%, representing a 5-year low. Their absolute public sector revenue also fell year on year, despite the wider public sector market growing by 2%. So, Gus, looking at this, what in your view has driven this decline in market share?
Well, per my earlier point, this is proof that being a strategic supplier is not actually a guarantee that the government is going to favor you in any way. I think the data is quite clear. In fact, in recent years, it's been a stated goal of the Cabinet Office to mitigate its over-reliance on specific suppliers by diversifying its supply chain and disaggregating contracts. And the declining market share of the strategic suppliers, whilst not dramatic, let's not, their market share is just kind of drifting down very gradually. But it is actually evidence that the government's policy of kind of disaggregating contracts and diversifying its suppliers is working. And again, I don't think the government gets enough credit for things which are actually working. And I think our analysis provides the evidence that in this case, the government is successfully kind of bringing other companies into its supply chain. They're not necessarily small companies, but they are working with other suppliers. I think Hollie will pick up that point in a second.
Mm. So on that, would you say then this trend is more of a long-term trend rather than just a blip in the data?
Yeah, I certainly don't think it's a blip. I think it is more of a trend. But actually, what I really think it is a pendulum. In recent years, the pendulum has swung away from strategic suppliers, not dramatically, but steadily, as the government has focused on other priorities. But the tighter the government purse becomes, and I think it is very tight. We're all aware of the fiscal pressure the government's under, the more likely it is that the pendulum swings back towards incumbent suppliers that have the deepest roots, the greatest experience, and can offer the biggest economies of scale. So I think of it as a pendulum. I wouldn't be surprised to see it swinging back in their favor over the next 2 or 3 years.
Mm. Um, but if you're a strategic supplier on this call and you're seeing this trend unfold, it may be cause for concern. If you, Gus, were a strategic supplier, how would you react to this, or how should you react to this?
Well, don't rest on your laurels. I think keep the focus on delivery so that you can make the case for why you are a better a better provider of these contracts than, 500 or so other companies, all of which are jostling to eat your lunch.
Good stuff. Hollie, for you, to flip the perspective around on this, this data would imply that contracting authorities are reducing their reliance on the strategic suppliers. In your view, what are the potential risks of this, as well as the opportunities of this transition?
I think this is a really interesting point, and I do think it's often forgotten about in, I suppose, the push to reduce over-reliance on household names. So love them or hate them, but the strategic suppliers are managed closely by the Cabinet Office. So they have MOUs, memorandums of understanding in place. They need to subcontract a proportion of their spend to SMEs and VCSEs and actually then report that spend to the Cabinet Office. They have designated Crown reps. I like to think of them as supplier relationship managers who are really focused on driving value for money, collaboration, efficiencies, all the good stuff. And there's actually little evidence to suggest that the spend with the strategic suppliers is going to SMEs or VCSEs, but instead it's simply pivoting to other large corporates who don't necessarily have those same requirements in place. So I suppose my questions would be, is this in line with the government's ambition to open up opportunities to SMEs? How is it going to get the same level of visibility into tiered spend? Is there sufficient resourcing in place to manage large corporates in cases where they're displacing the strategic supplier? There's no right or wrong answer here, but I would really caution anyone who celebrates the reduction in spend without considering the operational implications and relationship management required.
Mm, okay.
Trade-offs, in a word.
Mm.
Okay, so a few words of caution for buyers there. Okay, we'll move on to our next finding. And quickly before I do so, I've seen a couple people have raised their hands in the chat. I would encourage you, if you do have a question, please do leave it using the Q&A function if you want to anonymize yourself, or use the chat. We'll aim to get back to them at the concluding Q&A portion. So our next key finding is that UK-based strategic suppliers' share of group revenue is down. So just under half of the strategic suppliers are headquartered in the UK. You can see that just about on the small map in the bottom hand right corner of the screen. It's 19 strategic suppliers. In the latest full fiscal period, they accounted for 61% of total group revenue, down from 65% in financial year 1920. Gus, over to you first. Given the difficult economic situation that the UK is faced with, and the government's own ambitions to buy British, surely this seeming trend is cause for concern.
Is it though? I'm not so sure. I mean, ultimately, I think it's about a trade-off, as everything in business is. If you think about it, the government has tremendous purchasing power, and I think it can use that purchasing power in two ways. Either it can use it to get the most value for money by putting in place the conditions for really open competition, or it can use its purchasing power to favor special interest groups, however worthy they may be, such as homegrown companies or SMEs or VCSEs. Those are both completely worthy outcomes, but they are actually in opposition to one another. So, for example, if we take a trend like AI, the government is under kind of, the government is under some pressure to kind of be seen to be adopting AI. It certainly talks up the adoption of AI as a way of kind of providing more value for money and raising public sector productivity, etc. That's a perfectly laudable goal. But if it's really serious about that, let's face it, that's going to require a lot more spend with a handful of US companies which are kind of leading the AI transformation. And that will actually have that will reduce the spend with UK headquartered strategic suppliers. And so it will make the question of economic sovereignty a bit worse, not a bit better. So economic sovereignty, good. Adopting AI very quickly, good, but not necessarily kind of possible to do in parallel. There's a trade-off.
Yeah, a difficult balance. So sticking on this theme, Holly, of kind of geographical procurement, the 2023 Procurement Acts, which went live back in February this year, allows contracting authorities, specifically central government contracting authorities, to geographically reserve contracts. 9 months on from the go live date. From your experience and your work alongside buyers, how is this power being used so far, or not being used so far?
So we covered this in a recent webinar with Clark Wilmot and Tenders UK. So as you're saying, sort of the Procurement Act permits tenders to be reserved in a couple of ways. So one is for SMEs or VCSEs, the other is for specific geographical locations. And this was reaffirmed in one of the recent procurement policy notes. I think it was 005, if anyone wants to have a look. So at the moment, we're seeing pretty limited activity on both types of reservations, but I will really emphasize it is early days. And that makes sense, since the geographical piece of the puzzle is actually currently only allowed by central government and non-departmental bodies. So while the government intends on rolling it out to other parts of the public sector, it requires secondary legislation to make sure that this is compliant. So, for instance, this new mechanism actually currently conflicts with part of the Local Government Act, again, Section 17, if anyone wants to get in the real weeds of the procurement legislation. I would expect the use will certainly have an upwards trend as we see secondary legislation make its way through Parliament. And personally, I'm really excited to see this happen, as I see these mechanisms as an excellent way, or a tactic rather, that we could be stimulating local economies and leveraging procurement to deliver on the government's missions. I certainly agree with Gus that it's important to leverage the best talent, and if that's coming from overseas, then so be it. However, we also do need to drive innovation amongst British business, create globally renowned scale-ups and encourage them to stay here, listed on the UK Stock Exchange, rather than running off to the USA, where perhaps there's more money and relaxed legislation in place. So this mechanism could be one way of doing it.
Okay, thank you, Holly. And yes, as you said at the start of your answer, if anyone wants to learn more about geographical reservation powers under the new Procurement Act, then do head to our website and search for our webinar with Clark Wilmot. It's a very informative session. Okay, our next key finding, number 4, is that our report shows that revenue is down across all key strategic suppliers subsectors. So for the first time since we've been compiling this report, in the latest full fiscal year, public sector revenue earned by the strategic suppliers fell in every subsector. Notably, and what I'd like to focus on for this finding in particular, is that consulting strategic suppliers experienced the smallest drop in revenue, despite repeated government pledges to cut this spending. Hollie, if I could go to you first. You work closely with procurement teams day in, day out. Why is it that government can't seem to shake its reliance on outsourced consultants?
It's definitely an interesting conundrum, and it's one that I often see at odds with sort of the government's ambitions. So I do often say that every time a new policy report comes out, it gives the major consulting firms a clear need to approach procurement teams with. So take something like the local government devolution and reorganisation, one of the biggest shake-ups to local government in years. It's going to require a huge rethink of each region's sort of procurement profile, the activities that they're responsible for, areas for improvement and consolidation. There aren't many councils who will be able to do this without turning to the consulting firms. So whether the government likes it or not, often the services really are required. And I think that if it wants to reduce the role of consultants in delivering its required changes, I would really recommend that before it puts out a big policy change, like the latest announcement to abolish police and crime commissioners, do consider, is there sufficient guidance in place to do this without consultants?
And the reason I wanted to focus on this particular subsector, over to you now, for you, Gus, is that, as we all know, Tussell is regularly cited in the media for our reporting on public sector consultancy spending. It gets a lot of attention in the press. But given what we can see in the data in front of us, is this hype, this media attention, really justified in your view, Gus?
No, it isn't. Politicians and the media love to pretend that there are just billions of pounds to be saved by cutting wasteful consulting spend. But I think there are two fallacies in this line of thinking. Firstly, the proportion of overall spend on consulting is actually quite small. If you just look at the table on the slide in front of you, the big four, the consulting firms among the strategic suppliers, earned less than 5% of the total strategic supplier revenue. Last year, it was 1.1 billion out of about 25 billion. So in absolute terms, it's a material amount, but it's the smallest sector of all the ones on the chart. And secondly, people have to remember that the less the government spends on external consultants, the more it will have to spend on internal consultants, who may actually be, more expensive to recruit or to retrain, or may have less experience. So I suppose it comes back to the kind of theme I keep on kind of returning to today, which is trade-offs. I think the government was perhaps a bit imprudent by making this pledge, this promise to radically cut its consulting spend. I think for any incoming government that wants to reform and transform and, get a lot done, they're obviously going to need to kind of, amplify their reach through the use of external consultants. And it was probably a bit incautious to say that it would be anything but. But I think it's not the only promise the government made, which it's now kind of slightly regretting.
Okay, thank you, Gus. And before we move on, a reminder that in the full strategic suppliers report, we do have mini deep dives into each of these sectors. So if you're not a consulting firm, then do check out the full report where you can check out your sector's specific key findings and takeaways. And another just quick reminder before we go into our next key finding is that all of the insights in the strategic suppliers reports come from Tussell's market intelligence platform. Tussell's trusted by over 2/3 of these strategic suppliers to government, alongside government itself, to make data-led commercial decisions in the UK public sector market. To see how Tussell Insights can help you and your organisation into 2026, do scan the QR code on screen now to book in time with our team. And this QR code will also be at the end, so don't worry if you can't get your phone out quite in time. Okay, our next key finding is all about frameworks. So strategic suppliers are winning much more work via frameworks versus the market average. So in financial year 24-25, over half of the contracts won by the strategic suppliers were awarded via a framework or DPS dynamic market. This was more than twice the market average and nearly 3 times the average won by SMEs. Hollie, to go to you first, given the quite clear disparities we can see in the data here, would you say that frameworks are disproportionately favouring larger companies like the strategic suppliers at the expense of smaller firms?
I mean, the data could suggest this, but I personally think it's really important to consider, what's being procured, what is the go-to-market approach being adopted by these suppliers, the specific framework or DPS in question. There are a lot of different variables with this argument. And I think something that's in favour for SMEs is they can actually get away with not going via a framework by simply selling below threshold. So this would help explain why framework activity is lower. And anecdotally, I do often find that a lot of, I suppose, new entrants to the public sector or new SMEs do tend to bid blind, meaning they bid without any sort of pre-engagement prior to seeing that tender. Conversely, if you speak to a supplier with more experience in the public sector, they already know that for the first time that you're hearing about an opportunity is that tender stage, it's too late and you shouldn't bid. And that's the case even if you're a huge company like Microsoft. And I do wonder if that's playing a role here. I do also think it's worth mentioning that pre sort of Procurement Act launch, all frameworks were really locked for specified time periods. DPSs have always allowed for a more fluid sort of supply list, but historically they just haven't seen the same level of adoption as frameworks. I think the introduction of new frameworks should, in theory, help with this, and it will certainly be interesting to see what role they play in increasing direct SME engagement. But again, I think it's a bit too early to say at the moment.
And so sticking on that for a second, the Procurement Act. So though not necessarily reflected in this analysis here, because the last full fiscal year ended before the Procurement Act went live, or it was still kind of in that overlap period, frameworks have undergone a pretty substantial shift under the new procurement regime. Based on the data that you look at day in, day out, how is the framework landscape like today?
I think presently we're still seeing a lot of use of pre-Procurement Act frameworks. I think it's a bit unclear to say whether this is down to hesitancy with using new rules, or it could be something more specific, like the terms and conditions just being more favourable. I think, like I said earlier, it's a bit too early to say. The major framework providers have certainly got the wheels in motion, but the vast majority aren't going to go live until next year.
Okay. And for the suppliers on this call, we often get lots of questions about frameworks. So they're the topic of keen interest of public sector suppliers for good or ill reasons. What would your advice be for suppliers trying to compete effectively through framework agreements?
Definitely relates to my earlier point. A framework is not a means to an end, it's a start. It's a route to market. It is not a guaranteed way for you to be winning something. There is so much pre-engagement that happens before a tender is released via a framework. And often you find the framework or DPS that it goes via reflects this. And the strategic suppliers know this. And that is why they're so successful at winning business via them. So for any suppliers, don't stress about getting on every single framework. It's absolutely not worth it. Make sure that you're on the ones that see the most activity. They facilitate spend across the areas of the public sector that you want to work with, and then direct buyers to these agreements when they're ready to kick off that procurement.
So, Hollie, are you saying that you think a lot of kind of suppliers spend time trying to get onto a framework and then they just expect to kind of win business from it automatically, and instead they're on too many and have too high expectations instead of being on a few core ones and then really working them? Is that the gist of it?
That's definitely my view. And I don't think the huge values that come with framework agreements necessarily help. All it takes is one person in the senior management team of your company to say, this framework is worth, over £10 billion. All we need to get is 0.1% and we'll be successful. There are so many suppliers on a framework that don't win anything. And as we would fully understand and how we approach the public sector, it really is the final stage of, we want to work with you. How can we do this? As opposed to us sitting on, just waiting for tenders to come through. Especially something like G Cloud, where effectively no tenders really go via it.
Excellent. Thank you both. And a quick reminder for everyone on the call today, if you do want to learn more about framework agreements, especially the kind of what the data is actually showing about which contracts are being procured via them, I'll encourage everyone to check out our frameworks report, which went out early this year. If you head over to tussell.com/reports, it's there to download for free. So do check that out if frameworks are of interest to you and your organization. Okay, penultimate key finding is all around the 10 challenges to the strategic suppliers and who they are and why they matter. So each year, Tussell handpicks 10 companies that we consider challenges to the strategic suppliers group. So these are typically companies who earn just as much direct public sector revenue as the strategic suppliers, or who we'd consider to be delivering strategically important contracts, who we'd consider to be potential candidates for future strategic supplier status. In the past, a number of the challenges that we have added to the list have gone on to become strategic suppliers. So that includes people like Leidos, Boyce, and Computer Center. So focusing on this for a second, Hollie, we often get asked by our clients, especially in the months following the release of our latest strategic suppliers report, how do I become a strategic supplier? How does X company become a strategic supplier? What's your typical response to that question?
My immediate response is, are you sure? I always think with great power comes great responsibility with this cohort. They have strict reporting requirements, high public scrutiny, and as demonstrated in this report, they're often subject to calls for diversifying the supply chain. It's no doubt an excellent validation of their caliber. The strategic supply badge is not just given by virtue of earning £100 million per year from public bodies. It provides us evidence that you're capable of delivering critical services, and that no doubt helps with addressing, any question around a supplier's capability to deliver a certain service. But as really both me and Gus have emphasised, my immediate response is, are you sure?
Yeah, I'd back Hollie on that. I think be careful what you wish for. I mean, you certainly get more attention, but you also get a lot more scrutiny. And I think all of these strategic suppliers are spending material amounts of incremental cost on merely kind of meeting the reporting requirements and the higher standards of being a strategic supplier. So if the alternative is to be another big company that is making a lot of money from the public sector, but actually kind of flying under the radar and attracting a lot less attention to itself, that might actually be quite an attractive alternative.
Yes, it's very much a double-edged sword. It's
I
becoming
think
a
it is.
strategic supplier. Okay, cool. Right, on to our final key finding. So we concluded the strategic suppliers report by drilling into the sheer volume and value of strategic supplier contracts that are due to expire over the coming Parliament, at £41.7 billion to be exact, and just under £13 billion in 2026 alone. Gus, over to you. For suppliers on the call who aren't members of the strategic suppliers cohort, what can those companies be doing now to position themselves to potentially win these opportunities, these renewals?
Well, in a nutshell, I think they should be shaping opportunities, not merely responding to them. There is this kind of fallacy when selling to the public sector that it's all about kind of responding to tenders, but let's not forget tenders are by definition reactive. One responds to them, and they are competitive. I mean, the tender is not successful if it doesn't attract a range of different bidders. So if that is how you're doing all your BD, it's always going to be a lot more risky and a lot more kind of resource intensive than trying to kind of shape the demand or trying to get ahead of the demand, trying to shape the opportunity. So what I would be doing is making use of the available data, whether it's through Tussell or going back to the open data, however you want to do it. But the beauty of the public sector is that all that data is out there. And I would be kind of looking at all the relevant live contracts in my sector or subsector and kind of looking at that information by contract renewal date. So kind of parsing all the contracts coming up in 12, 24, 36 months time to identify opportunities where it makes sense to pre-engage with those buyers to really discover what their needs are and to really make the case for why you can offer a better service at a lower cost than the incumbent. So it's all about kind of planning ahead. And incidentally, in a bit of a plug to Tussell, you can also do that using a new kind of feature that we've rolled out called Early Opportunities, which basically mines signal of future buying intent from thousands of public sector documents hiding in plain sight. Things like meeting minutes and kind of board papers and strategy documents from which we've extracted all of these kind of pre-tender signals of kind of future demand. So there are loads of ways for you as a supplier to get ahead of this demand, and that's what separates the really successful people from the merely reactive ones.
Mm. So conversely, if you're a strategic supplier on the call today, and you're seeing these numbers, there's a lot of potential incumbent contracts that you have potentially going out the door. What would your advice be in the face of these upcoming contract renewals?
Well, as I said before, don't rest on your laurels. Be across the data. Make sure that you're not blindsided by any of your own kind of upcoming contract renewals, which I think in big companies probably does happen. And don't take anything for granted. The UK market is tough at the moment. I think everybody feels it. And the best way to be successful is to stay really, really close to your customer. If you're not and you take something for granted, there's a lot of challengers, big and small, in the market who would be only too happy to eat your lunch.
Mm. Hollie, any reflections, any key bits of advice looking at this data?
Just to really echo what Gus said, I think just reacting to tenders is an excellent way to get a really bad ego boost and to really feel like there isn't any opportunity in the public sector. I cannot stress enough the importance of pre-engagement and not assuming that the public sector is going out to tender for your services. They might, in fact, prefer to procure an entirely different way, let's say through direct contracts through a framework such as G Cloud. So don't underestimate the power of pre-engagement and really shaping the opportunity and even the specification that ends up getting used.
Yeah, well said.
Excellent. Well, that seems like a good place to conclude our presentation and discussion part of the webinar. Thank you again, both of you, for your reflections and insights so far today. I'm sure it's been very helpful for those on the call to dissect a bit behind the data and kind of get the broader meanings as to what it might mean for them. Just a reminder that you can look at the underlying platform, the Tussell platform that was used to create all of the insights and all of the reports that we create here at Tussell. So again, if you would like to get in a live demonstration of how the platform works and how it might benefit your organization going into 2026, do just scan the QR code on screen now. What we want to do now is we've left around 20 minutes and good time for audience Q&A. We've had quite a few questions come in from the audience, which we'd like to try and address as many as we can, but please do keep submitting them as we go. So one question that came in from Owen was around AI procurement. So at a recent presentation that Tussell delivered at DigiGov, thank you for coming along, Owen, was that we presented on the scale of AI procurement across the UK public sector. And Owen is asking, what role are the strategic suppliers playing in this surge in AI procurement that Tussell has been reporting on? Either one of you, what role are the strategic suppliers playing in AI procurement today?
I'll take this first. I think there was actually a slide on that in the strategic suppliers report. We looked at the number of AI related contracts that they'd won by year. I think in the most recent year it was around 26 contracts across all of the strategic suppliers. I think the short answer is that the impact of AI still seems to be relatively modest on the contracts being won by the strategic suppliers, but we are seeing that grow from a very small base year on year, and I can only assume that it will continue to grow over the coming years. Hollie, what's your view?
Yeah, I concur with Gus. I mean, I think you're seeing nearly all of them sort of dip their toe in the water. You know, some even perhaps a bit less conventional, like Serco, seeing AI be adopted in a lot of its contact centers. Of course, you're seeing the more obvious ones like Microsoft, who are absolutely, you know, leading the charge. I think Owen also had a related question where he was saying he expected perhaps the more core AI suppliers, I can only assume people like OpenAI, to be featuring in this cohort. And the reason why they're not in here is because the Cabinet Office actually just has not added them as a strategic supplier. So this isn't a report that sort of we've come up with 39 suppliers in it. This is a list of suppliers that the Cabinet Office provides, that it identifies. As we said, it's not just to do with spend, it is also the services that they're delivering. Think about a strategic supplier as someone that, if they went under, if things went wrong, would be very disruptive to the UK public services. That is how they're getting their name. And for whatever reason, major suppliers like OpenAI just have not made it onto that list yet.
Yeah, but it's still early days.
It's very early days.
It well move the composition of the strategic suppliers could well move more in an AI direction. I think that's quite a likely path. as a company, we have actually reported quite a lot on AI adoption by government. If anybody isn't aware of it, there's a really good live tracker of government AI contracts on our website. I think to date there have been AI specific contracts worth about 3.3 billion pounds awarded by the government so far. And that's a really big number. It's really material. You can't get around it. But it's still something like less than 2% of all IT contracts awarded by the government over that period. It's large, it's growing, but it still has a lot more room for growth.
Mm.
Okay.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you both. Next question I want to cover is from Paula. So Paula is asking around the defense spend that we're seeing in this report. So I'll just pivot quickly back to that subsector slide. So essentially the crux of Paula's question is, what's the general trajectory for this spending with defense strategic suppliers? What's our kind of key takeaways for the defense sector, and how does this look to potentially change for the coming years? Either one of you, what were your kind of key reflections into our defense related analysis of this report?
Look, I'll come in first if you don't mind. So I've actually got a really kind of strong view on this. When we were doing the strategic suppliers report, I was really surprised by the trajectory of the spend with the aerospace and defense companies. It wasn't actually growing very much year on year. Well, in fact, it was shrinking. It shrank by 7%. And actually, it was relatively flat over the 6 or 7 years that the report looks at. And the reason that that kind of surprised me so much is because we live in an era of quite a lot of kind of geopolitical instability, not least because of the war in Ukraine. There's a lot more emphasis on kind of defense and rearmament. And from how it's kind of, discussed in the news, I personally would have expected to see a much steeper increase in government spending with those defense companies among the strategic suppliers. And that is not what our data is showing. So either there's a bit of a disconnect between the kind of rhetoric and the reality. And I think that's a possibility. Um, and then the other factor is that with the defense sector, because of the kind of sensitive, confidential nature of the contracts, it's also very possible that not all of these contracts are coming to light. I suspect that the defense-related revenue that we are showing is almost certainly understated. So for that reason, one has to be a bit more careful about about the data. But in general, I am surprised that even for the data that's published, we're not seeing more of a kind of upward trend on spending with those companies.
Hollie, any reflections from you?
Yeah, I would echo Gus in terms of like there are nuances when it comes to MOD procurement. Naturally, national security does impact how much we're going to release to the public. But I think that there also definitely is something around like rhetoric versus the realities. So yes, we hear a lot about the need for increased defense spending. But I think it was also last week that, there was an announcement that the MOD is currently preparing a plan for a 2 billion army training contract gets scrapped. So it's certainly not, I suppose like there are always risks that procurement with the MOD, it's not guaranteed. But I do think the transparency piece almost certainly will fall into this. And I think it's also worth considering when thinking about increases in defence spending, they might not always necessarily actually just come from the MOD alone. So something I have found quite interesting is looking at increases in things like security services amongst the FCDO, where again we're seeing a big uptick as we're trying to protect things like embassies overseas. So there's nuances effectively.
Okay, thank you both. Got quite a few more interesting questions I want to cover, so I'll move on. Anonymous question that came through starts with: budgets at contractors are rapidly shrinking, with even less room to do things like front-end early engagement and positioning, as it's often seen by perhaps more senior folk in the company that it's an uncertain outcome by doing these kind of activities. What would your advice be on using data smartly to present an internal case for doing early engagement and less reactivity?
Hollie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think you're right. We're definitely seeing you know, in many areas, particularly like local government, sort of reduced spend. However, it's always going to be about prioritization. And I would say the most successful suppliers are really aligning themselves with the most important priorities in an individual organization. So take something like local government, things like social care are undeniably one of the biggest expenditures. So thinking about how can you align your services which are driving efficiencies in those areas. So I would say the best way to sort of work with pre-engagement is around understanding that organization, what matters to them, and really aligning yourselves with that sort of rhetoric. And I suppose the biggest thing is inspiring them.
Yeah, I really, I don't think anyone ever did too little kind of pre-engagement. I think putting in the time, really understanding your customer and making sure that you're offering a solution to whatever problem they had. Kind of whether you're selling to government or to consumers or to businesses, I don't think people ever I don't think people ever kind of did too little of that, to be honest.
Thank you both. Next question, another anonymous question. Incumbent strategic suppliers often have informal alliances with partners, effectively locking out others out of frameworks, and it creates a monopoly environment and puts off many suppliers despite what the data is saying. So, is the public sector genuinely open-minded to new players? It's a good question. Hollie, what do you think?
Very interesting question. Lots to digest there. I would say that one of the first things that comes to mind when thinking about the importance of collaboration is you will hear often from the public sector, collaboration, not competition. They want partners, not suppliers. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of working towards building those relationships and sort of overcoming those hurdles, although I do absolutely hear you. Is government open to new entrants? Absolutely, the rhetoric is that. Speaking from the work that I do with Tech UK on the Scale Up Council, we're constantly having government departments approach us saying they want to find ways to work with scale-ups, which is why I was referencing the point I made earlier around, as Bradley as well also suggested I reiterate it, is for below threshold opportunities when we're thinking about reserving those. That is an excellent way for new entrants to unlock funding in a time where raising capital is becoming even harder. And that is one of the reasons government is looking to do this. So I would say they are open. It do focus on the departments that I suppose that know how to do it well, though. So a department I suppose has really impressed me is DSIP, with actually how they're utilising the competitive flexible as a way to engage with smaller suppliers, particularly with things like AI, by taking a more pilot approach in procurement that enables them to scale if things are working. So utilise new mechanisms like this. Do prioritize finding partnerships as a way to open up doors. And yeah, just a reminder, it's really important to have that pre-engagement to really combat that real life feeling of just being locked out, particularly around frameworks. I hope that's helpful.
I think it's a really good question. I like it. It's a nice, direct, kind of blunt question. And it probably feels, to some suppliers like they are being locked out. I don't think there's any kind of, institutional failing in the procurement process. But I think, like any buyer, the government is risk averse. So, working with new people is always a bit harder than just kind of carrying on working with the existing ones. And also, the more thinly stretched these procurement teams become, the more kind of inertia there is. It's easier and cheaper to maintain something than it is to, to change it all up. So there are actually perfectly kind of understandable, natural reasons why the government may be, may be a bit reluctant to mix up its direct suppliers. And I think it just puts all the more emphasis on those challengers, on those companies that are not incumbents, to really do that pre-engagement, to make sure that they're really building those relationships, they're really listening to the customer, and they're really coming up with solutions to the government problems. Ultimately, that is what the government wants. It wants to get more value for money. It wants to deliver better public services. My sense is that if you are a supplier that kind of is clearly offering that, I think the government will welcome it. Might not be easy, might take some time, but I don't think there's any kind of conspiracy against kind of new suppliers.
Mm. Sticking on this theme, conscious of time, we had another question come in asking where and how do you identify the right buyers to stake out relationship building for? Hollie, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say it's about using hard data to inform your strategy. You can't boil the ocean, it's not as simple as sending out some sort of AI generated email to the entire of the public sector, just waiting for one of them to respond. It's about being really purposeful, finding the right people to engage with, getting talking points so you can understand what are their pain points, what is the job to be done, how can you really help with solving those, and making sure that you're being a lot more purposeful with your time. You're not doing a, what is it called, a spray and pray approach, I suppose.
Mm.
And use data from Tussell to identify who is buying your services. I mean, it's as simple as that. If you're providing kind of, I don't know, translation services, you can go to Tussell, you can go to the open data, and you can literally see who has a track record of purchasing translation services at what cost, with what regularity, and from whom. And all things being equal, those are probably the people to focus your BD efforts on.
And that actually points to a related point that I always say the best suppliers are thinking about what is the problem that their offering solves. So translation is a great example. If you're also selling something like AI and you want to look at where can you drive a lot more efficiencies and where can you give them a reduced spend on that service through the productivity that your tools will offer.
Mm. Cool. Thank you both. Just conscious of time, I think we have time for one more question before we depart. So we'll go to Chris's question asking, have you seen the use of frameworks increase since the introduction of the 2023 Procurement Act? Do you think they'll be used more frequently moving forwards due to the lower reporting requirements compared to open tender? Hollie, I think this is one for you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, and we've definitely seen like reduced tendering levels, of course, pre to the Procurement Act launching. Everyone knows that huge spike that went up. Is it that frameworks are being used more? Potentially. We're not seeing a reduced amount of, contracts being awarded. It could also be down to existing contracts being extended. It could also be down to different procedures being used. It's hard to say if it's definitively yes, it's absolutely, a higher use of frameworks because of the new act coming in. I think it's a few things going out on play, and I think it's to be expected that we're still, I suppose, getting in with the movements of the procurement and getting used to the new rules.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a perfect place to stop, 11 on the dot. Thank you all again for joining us for today's session. We hope you've left with a lot of insights and takeaways from today's discussions. Thank you again, Hollie and Gus, for your reflections and insights today. Just a quick reminder again, if you want to book in a live demonstration of the platform used to create all of the data and analysis that you've seen today, do just scan the QR code on screen now to book in time with our team. And if we didn't answer any of your questions during the Q&A, apologies, but do feel free to reach out via LinkedIn or contact@tussell.com and we'll answer your question there.
Thanks a
Excellent.
lot, everyone.
Thanks, too.
Have a really good day.